Hello, and welcome to the Hydrogen Hub applicant webinar. I'm Katrina Pielli, Director of the Engagement Office in the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, or OSED as we call it, and I will be your moderator for today. First, a few housekeeping items. This Teams webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the U.S. Department of Energy's OSED website. All participants are in listen-only mode, and the names of attendees will not be available in the recording. To turn on live captions, click on the three dots for More in the top banner, and then select Turn on Live Captions. Note that we are not taking questions and feedback today. However, we include the link to the Hydrogen Hub's webpage and Q&A email address at the end of the presentation. Finally, a copy of today's presentation and the recording of today's webinar will be posted on the OSED webpage shortly. Next slide, please. The purpose of this Hydrogen Hubs webinar is to provide broad feedback and address certain themes that emerged during the review of concept papers from applicants. Only publicly available information provided in the OSED Funding Opportunity Announcement, or FOA, will be discussed in the webinar. Attending this webinar and watching the recording is completely voluntary and will not impact an applicant's selection. There are no particular advantages or disadvantages in the evaluation process with respect to participating on the webinar today. This webinar is also not a rule or regulation, and the recommendations it contains may not apply to a particular situation based upon the individual facts and circumstances. So if there are any inconsistencies between a specific FOA and the statements in this webinar, that FOA is the controlling document, and applicants should rely on that FOA language. Next slide, please. For today's webinar, we will first hear opening remarks from OSED Director David Crane. Then we will dive into the details of applications and discuss community benefits plans and energy justice. We will close by discussing the U.S. National Hydrogen Strategy and other related opportunities across the department. We would like to note that during the Community Benefits Plan portion of our webinar, we do have two non-DOE officials whose views do not necessarily reflect the views of the department, and their discussion does not supplement or amend the requirements of the FOA. Now, with all that, please join me in welcoming David Crane, the Director of the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. David, we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Katrina. And thank everyone who is participating in this call for your interest in our H2 Hub program. I particularly want to thank the prospective H2 Hub sponsors who submitted an H2 Hub concept paper on or before November 7th of last year, and by so doing qualified themselves to submit a full application on or before the due date of April 7th of this year. We at the DOE are very excited about the opportunity we have been given through multiple acts of Congress to catalyze the transition to the hydrogen economy, and we were gratified to find out from the just concluded concept paper phase of our process that the privilege and excitement we all feel at being at this pivot point in the energy history of our country is shared by so many of you. To put some numbers against what I am saying, the DOE's Office of Clean Energy Demonstration was allocated $8 billion by Congress to this H2 Hub program, making it one of the largest financial assistance programs in DOE history. In September, we committed $6 to $7 billion of that amount to a FOA, which elicited in November 79 concept papers representing an aggregate total project cost of over $200 billion, some $60 billion of which constituted a request for federal funds, with the remaining $150 billion-ish being a commitment of private sector capital. In December, after thorough independent and internal review, the sponsors associated with those 79 potential concept papers each received encourage or discourage letters from our office. I am pleased to report that 33 of the prospective applicants, representing approximately $34 billion of requested federal funds, were encouraged to submit full applications. The depth and breadth of the response to our FOA, I believe, eclipses by a significant margin any of the hydrogen programs being pursued by our friends in other like-minded countries around the world, raising the prospect that all of you, catalyzed by us at the DOE, will secure first mover advantage for the United States in the race to fully commercialize hydrogen as the go-to energy commodity of the 21st century. So today I have the privilege of kicking off this informational webinar, which I am told is itself an unusual, if not unprecedented, feature of DOE solicitations. There is one and only one purpose underlying this event, and that is to give all of you the clearest possible steer that we can give you on how to strengthen your proposals between now and the final submittal date of April 7th. I encourage everyone to listen carefully to everything said on this call, and if you miss something, go back and listen again. As Katrina said, this webinar is being recorded. Final proposals are going to be subject to an extremely rigorous review process, and we want all of you to work as creatively and intelligently as possible to make our evaluation task as difficult as it possibly can be, to make every H2 Hub proposal 100% worthy of federal funding. Before I pass the floor back to Katrina to introduce the experts who really know what they're talking about, let me very briefly give you food for thought on 5 topics. First, somewhere in your proposal, focus on the impact of your project. Of course, positive impact begins with giving us confidence that you can successfully implement what you propose. But spend at least a little space elaborating your vision of what your project could unleash. We are tasked by Congress with using the Hydrogen Hub funds to create, sooner rather than later, the pillars of a national hydrogen economy. And that guides us towards replicable, long-term, commercially viable hubs with the strongest possible ripple effect, rather than one-off demonstrate and dismantle science projects. Second, think carefully about the boundaries of your H2 Hub proposal and make sure they are clearly delineated for our consideration. Per my first point above, we are pleased to know what hydrogen-related infrastructure outside the boundaries of your proposal that you think may be catalyzed by us giving you federal funds to direct inside the project boundaries. But we need to have a clear idea what aspects of your project we are being asked to apply federal funding to. On this point, let me reiterate a point that we tried to make clear in our encourage discourage letters. Geographically adjacent or geographically overlapping hubs are absolutely permitted to combine their efforts during this final application phase, if you, the sponsors, believe that by so doing, you create a 1 + 1 = 3 situation. If we agree, then we are all for it. But the decision to combine or not to combine at this point is in the sole discretion of you, the various sponsors. Third, take very seriously the Community Benefits Program section of the FOA. As set forth in the FOA, the evaluation weighting assigned to this element is very significant, and we take it very, very seriously. Even if your institution as a sponsor likes to believe that being a good neighbor is embedded in your institutional culture, I would encourage you to consider a level of outreach and inclusion of affected stakeholders that may be beyond anything you have previously contemplated. And let me emphasize that we ask you to consider this, not only because it simply is the right thing to do, but also because, from the DOE perspective, to do so materially de-risk the project timetable from delay due to state or local opposition. The last thing we want to see at the DOE is $1 billion of our precious hydrogen hub capital not deployed because an otherwise worthy project ran into entrenched opposition from local communities, which had been disregarded during this process. Fourth, we have been asked repeatedly by interested parties to describe what we at DOE consider to be the perfect H2 hub. The answer to that question is that there is no such thing. There is no single DOE endorsed prototype of an H2 hub that we can point you to. Congress quite explicitly has directed OSED to fund a series of hydrogen hubs which are geographically dispersed, use a variety of input fuels, and serve 4 distinct addressable markets, all within the overarching goal of laying the foundation of a national hydrogen economy. As such, in furtherance of congressional intent, we will utilize portfolio theory not only to evaluate the proposals based on their intrinsic strengths, but also on how they fit into the mosaic of our overall hydrogen portfolio. We recognize that this introduces an element to this competitive process which is somewhat beyond your control. But we nonetheless believe that if you remain mindful of OSED's hydrogen mission, you can make strategic and tactical decisions over the next couple of months, which will enhance the prospects of your application. And finally, for those of you listening very carefully, you will note that I have already mentioned the final proposal submission date of April 7th, 2023, twice during my remarks. Please take that date, April 7th, 2023, very, very seriously. For reasons that are too numerous to mention and too compelling to describe, the chances that that due date, April 7th, 2023, gets extended are extremely remote. Please do what it takes to get your submission in on or before that date. To be a little more specific, April 7th, 2023 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, now I've mentioned April 7th 6 times. So with that, Katrina, let me pass the microphone back to you with a final word of gratitude to each and every one of you. Thank you for applying your extraordinary experience and expertise to our H2 Hub forward process. And thank you for the privilege of working with you to kick off the hydrogen transition for the benefit of all Americans and ultimately for the benefit of all humanity. Katrina, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Next up, we'll hear from Eric Miller. Eric is the Associate Director for OSED Project Management and also the Division Lead for Hydrogen Hubs. Eric, the floor is yours.
Good morning. I'd like to first thank all the applicants for preparing and submitting concept papers. The papers gave us great insight into how parties are working on their hubs and how the hubs are likely to materialize. My comments today are largely based on what we learned reading those concept papers. First thing I want to talk about is the need for specifics in the applications. In many of the concept papers, we saw descriptions of hubs with multiple elements. And by elements, I mean production plants, end uses, storage, and connective infrastructure. And we saw a wide range of technologies, capacities, and combinations of these elements, which highlights David's point that hydrogen hubs will not be a one-size-fits-all situation. Somewhat understandably, since this was only for concept papers, we did not see many specifics on cost and other items for each of the elements. But in the applications, we will want to see these specifics. So we want you to be clear on costs, schedules, risks, community benefit plans for each and all elements of your hub. Let's talk a bit about the scope of your applications. And again, this is echoing a comment that David made. In preparing your applications, consider classifying the elements of your hub, or the elements, I should say, into two categories. First are elements which you are proposing for joint funding. Those are the elements for which DOE needs the most information. I'm going to call these your proposed elements or your proposed hub. Second are elements and activities that are in the same vicinity as your proposed hub, but for which you are not proposing to be part of DOE funding. These could be elements that maybe already exist, or they will be built in the future without any assistance from DOE. I'm going to refer to these as out-of-scope activities. Ideally, your application will describe the out-of-scope activities and how they will help foster a regional marketplace. But we won't need the same level of information about them as we need for the elements of your hub proposal. In concept papers, there was a little bit of lack of clarity on whether elements were part of the proposed hub or the out-of-scope activities. Again, it's somewhat understandable at the concept paper stage, but in your applications, please distinguish between these types of elements. Next, I want to talk about cost estimates. We expect in your applications to see the most information on cost for phases 1 and 2, as those are relatively near term. For phase 3, which is the construction phase in our terminology, We understand the cost estimate will be less certain at the time of application, but it should become more certain as we progress through phases 1 and 2. Your application still needs to give us an estimate of construction costs. And when you're putting that estimate together and describing it, please also discuss your plans for funding your portion of the costs and also your plans or your proposed plan for handling cost overruns. DOE is not accepting the cost overrun risk, and therefore we want to see your plan for handling it. And your ability to fund your portion of the construction and frankly all costs will be a factor we consider in selecting recipients. And one more point on costs. For your proposed elements, give us both the total cost and the amount you're asking DOE to pay. And if for some reason, and this is acceptable, if for some reason you are proposing different DOE funding levels for different facilities or different budget categories, please be clear on that as well. So ultimately, DOE wants to fund projects that get built, and your application should help us assess how likely this is to occur. Towards that end, you should discuss where your hub stands on key development activities, and especially on commercial agreements for offtake and feedstock supply. We realize these kinds of agreements and other development activities are likely a work in progress at the time you are preparing your application, but the more you can help us understand their status, the better. So for instance, if you have started discussions on your offtake agreement, let us know that. If you have an MOU in place, tell us that. And of course, if you have a signed offtake agreement, let us know about that. And this doesn't just apply to offtake agreements. If your production plant requires electricity or natural gas or some other feedstock, give us an update and let us know where your work stands on obtaining an agreement to obtain those feedstocks. Next, I want to talk about the prime and sub recipients or prime and sub applicants. In your application, please be clear on the parties or the party that will serve as the prime recipient. And if there's any sub recipients, identify those as well. Ultimately, any award would be between the prime recipient and DOE, and the prime recipient is going to be responsible for implementing the project. The prime is also the one that will submit invoices to DOE, that will receive payments from DOE, and will be responsible for ensuring all federal requirements for financial assistance are met. So again, be clear on who is going to play the role as prime recipient and describe the qualifications of that entity to both execute the project and to comply with requirements for federal financial assistance. And while we're talking about prime and subrecipients, please note that in the Hydrogen Hub's FOA, there are requirements that both the prime and the subrecipients be domestic entities. And to be a domestic entity, as it's laid out in the FOA, the entity must be formed under laws of a U.S. state or territory and have majority domestic ownership and control and have a U.S. place of business. To streamline our review process, we would like applicants to declare their domestic entity status in their applications. This is a slight change to the FOA, and we will issue a minor modification on this point. And as has been discussed in some of the questions and answers that have been submitted, we will consider waivers to the domestic entity requirements, but we can only do so as part of the application reviews, and we will have to consider each one on a case-by-case basis. We've also received several questions on confidentiality of information submitted in applications. As a former developer, I'm familiar with these kind of concerns. I suspect many of the questions come from concerns about freedom of information or FOIA requests being made to DOE. You should know that confidential business information received by DOE as part of an application is generally exempted from being released under FOIA, and DOE will protect your confidential information to the maximum extent allowed by law. After the selections are made, the final agreement and award documents may be releasable under FOIA, but we will continue to work to protect the underlying confidential information contained in your applications. If you have information you're especially concerned about, please follow the instructions in the FOA and the Q&A log about clearly marking documents and files that contain confidential information. Next, I want to talk about two topics that are related in a way. NEPA, or the National Environmental Protection Act, and financing milestones. DOE's funding actions are subject to NEPA, and DOE will need to complete its NEPA review prior to the start of construction. Again, phase 3 in our timeline. Our NEPA review will need to consider the potential impacts of DOE-funded activities, including any connected actions. The decision on what counts as a connected action will be made by DOE based on the specifics of each hub and the proposed activities. For hubs with many elements, DOE could potentially complete NEPA reviews separately for some elements, but only if DOE can determine that those elements have independent utility, meaning those elements can and would operate independently from other elements in the hub. If applicants want to facilitate this kind of analysis, they may assist DOE's determination by describing how certain elements may meet the criteria for independent utility. You could do this in your application, or you could also do it afterwards as part of phase 1 activities. But keep in mind the decision as to whether a set of hub elements have independent utility will be DOE's. In a similar vein, financing milestones may need to be met by the entire hub or could be done for select elements. Again, prior to approving the start of phase 3, DOE will want to see milestones completed similar to what would be needed for a private project financing. Again, if you're proposing a hub with many elements, DOE can consider allowing a subset of the hub's elements to move into construction according to their own progress, but only to the extent it can be shown that those elements are economically viable on their own. This is similar to NEPA, and the DOE will determine if the elements are economically independent, but recipients can assist with us with making that case. Last topic I want to cover is permits and regulations. Again, we want to fund projects and hubs that get built, and obviously receipt of permits will be critical to this. And we expect that in many cases, to receive your permits, there will need to be some progress made on state and local regulations as they relate to hydrogen. And this work could also be important to helping us move towards a national hydrogen network. For these reasons, we want applications to assess both permits needed for the project and development of any accompanying regulations. So to give an example, if your hub involves installing the first hydrogen refueling stations in a given state, and you are uncertain how the state's regulators may apply their rules to hydrogen, then your work plan should factor in the time, the effort, and perhaps the risk needed to clarify the regulations and obtain any necessary approvals. Hopefully that helps explain what we are thinking of when we're talking about regulations and permits. Those are all the topics I have for today. One final point though, please take note of the content and the encourage, discourage messages we posted in exchange at the completion of the concept paper reviews, as that message was carefully crafted. Again, thank you for your attention and interest in hydrogen hubs. Now I'll hand it back to Katrina.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Catherine Clark, who is an Energy Justice Liaison for OSED. Catherine will describe several themes from our review of the Community Benefits Plan components of the concept papers. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Katrina. As Katrina mentioned, today I'm going to talk about some things to consider when developing a Community Benefits Plan, or CBP. This is not meant to provide a comprehensive overview of CBP requirements, but like Eric, who we were just hearing from, my comments today are largely based on what we learned reviewing the concept papers. DOE wants to fund hubs that get built, and this will depend on engagement with and support from host communities, relevant labor partners and workforces, and other impacted groups. I would note that in the United States, there have already been hydrogen projects canceled due to community pushbacks and concerns. Hydrogen hubs community benefits plans, which include community and labor engagement, investing in the American workforce, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and the Justice 40 initiative, will help projects be successful and long-lasting, while driving the creation of good-paying jobs, tackling the climate crisis, and ensuring stronger access to economic, environmental, and other benefits for underserved and overburdened communities. While the Community Benefits Plan FOA requirements are intentionally flexible to generate the best approaches from applicants and their partners that are appropriate for their hub and responsive to the communities, workers, and groups impacted by their proposed hub, applicants should ensure that they are addressing all 4 CBP topic areas with thoughtfulness and depth. DOE wants to see hub proposals that proactively address both benefits and negative impacts of hubs on communities and workforces. Many of the concept papers describe potential benefits of hubs to communities and workforces, and understandably, since this was only the concept paper phase, we didn't see many specifics, especially on potential negative impacts that could occur from these hubs. In applications, we want to see specifics for both benefits and potential negative impacts. Each application should include detailed description of benefits and negative impacts, with special attention to existing cumulative burdens, historic harms, and priority concerns raised by impacted groups. This is especially critical for cases in which hubs will impact communities already facing significant burdens. Finally, these specific benefits and negative impacts should be specific and measurable, and to the greatest extent possible, include metrics and methods to track, monitor, and report each impact over time. You'll notice that the requirement is for a community benefits plan and not a community benefits assessment. And that's because the core purpose is really to move beyond sort of a vision or assessment and towards concrete goals, outcomes, and implementation plans. In other words, really answering the question, what will the project team do to ensure projects deliver meaningful benefits and minimize and mitigate any negative impacts? These clear and concrete implementation strategies should be matched with milestones and metrics to measure their success. And finally, of course, a plan wouldn't be meaningful without the capacity to implement it. So DOE asks applicants to outline what resources, including staff with relevant expertise and budget, will be used to implement the CBP. High-quality implementation plans will include robust methods to ensure accountability to impact communities and workforces, providing real pathways for their priorities and feedback to impact decisions in all phases of the hub. For example, applicants could discuss how siting decisions could be made based on community input and demonstrate plans to enter into negotiated workforce and community agreements. Community benefits plans should include transparent mechanisms for two-way engagement and accountability to impacted groups. DOE recognizes that there are many ways to develop hubs in partnership with labor and community. We also recognize that some of these approaches may be new to applicants. In addition to this webinar, we've developed a guidance document that is posted with the FOA that provides detailed information and examples. All applicants are encouraged to read the Community Benefits Plan guidance under application forms and templates in exchange as they develop their community benefits plans. Thanks so much for your attention, and Katrina, I'll turn it back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Catherine. So next we will have a deep dive from 2 experts who will share some of their observations about implementing projects to ensure community benefits and minimization of harms. But first, I'd like to provide some framing remarks about the transformative and historic opportunity that we are embarking on together. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or bill, is a long overdue investment in our nation's energy and transportation infrastructure. The Hydrogen Hub's overall program represents $8 billion to advance a national clean hydrogen network that will contribute sustainably and substantially to decarbonizing multiple sectors of the economy and help us meet our climate goals. The bill programs will be incredibly important, not only for addressing our infrastructure needs, but tackling the climate crisis, while also providing good jobs and benefits to communities that have traditionally been excluded from these opportunities. This includes communities of color and low-income communities who have, unfortunately, disproportionately bore the environmental burdens of the energy system while reaping so too few of its economic benefits. And so, as DOE strives to reinforce and revitalize our energy infrastructure, it is incumbent on all of us to ensure that our energy systems of the future are not merely functional, but just. And this means that we must seek to remediate the historic harms on our frontline communities and strive to ensure that our future energy systems are more equitable, accessible, affordable, clean, and consider the input and voices of those who have historically lacked access to the decision-making process in the past. This is energy justice. And energy justice is fundamentally about ensuring the benefits and burdens of the energy system are equitably distributed. These benefits are broadly defined to include more than just dollars. They encompass activities and outcomes that improve communities and create more opportunities for access to clean, affordable energy. We've identified 8 policy priorities that projects can directly target to meet the goals of the Justice 40 initiative. By identifying measurable, trackable benefits that flow to underserved, overburdened communities, such as dollars invested, jobs created, energy costs lowered, and more, we can achieve the essence of the Justice 40 initiative and transform communities for the better. And so as we think about implementation of our hydrogen hubs, we must think critically about how commercial scale facilities can be more inclusive of the feedback expressed by communities with energy justice concerns and underrepresented groups. And we must also ensure that we design programs to ensure minimal environmental impact, including impacts that risk exposure to additional pollution in already overburdened communities, and mechanisms for accountability to and transparency with those communities. As Catherine mentioned, again and again, research shows that communities of color are routinely exposed to more environmental hazards and pollutions than they create. And these frontline communities understand that new projects, even if they're designed to avert catastrophic climate change, could mean increased exposure to these environmental hazards and harms for their communities and their families. And so because of this history and these patterns and the legacy of the impact of our energy system, our efforts must extend beyond simply hearing community feedback. To be effective, we must also acknowledge the potential environmental harms associated with our hydrogen hubs, including safety considerations, potential for increased emissions of non-greenhouse gas pollutants in our host communities. We also must be forthright and committed to answering how these possible harms can be addressed and mitigated from project beginning to end. And so this means we need to get broad and meaningful participation from all areas of society involved and make a special effort to include those communities that are now most burdened by our existing energy system. And so here at DOE, we're working hard to ensure that communities impacted by the legacy of pollution will have the support that they need to actively participate in shaping our future. And so all of us have the responsibility to ensure that communities on the front line receive the benefits of our clean energy transition. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And as you think about the innovation and ingenuity that we need to make all this possible, I really want to impress upon each of you that your work must be inclusive and it must consider carefully the things that we've highlighted today. I encourage you to put all of the levers at your disposal to creatively conduct this work, building these hydrogen hubs so that it is respectful of our environment, our resources, and our people. That is our collective goal. And so thank you so much for the work that you do and the work that you're about to do. And so now we have a wonderful opportunity to hear from 2 workforce, energy justice, engagement, and tribal experts about their experiences with implementation of community benefits activities. And so just a quick reminder, I do want to flag again that these panelists are not DOE officials, and so their views do not necessarily reflect the views of the agency. And again, the discussions of this webinar do not amend or supplement the requirements of the FOA, and the FOA is the controlling document, and applicants should rely on that language. So thank you so much. Now I would like to introduce our first speaker. We're excited to have Doug Block, Principal and Strategic Consultant with Block Strategies, with us today. So Doug, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katrina, and I want to thank the Department of Energy for the opportunity to participate today. It is a pleasure to be here. In my nearly 30 years of doing this work, I've often found myself sitting at a table with employers, labor unions, and community groups, and each group is looking at the other one like they're speaking a foreign language. In my experience, This is particularly true for the employer side of the table because, truth be told, there are just not as many American workers in unions as there used to be. For many employers, a union is outside their realm of experience. So when a union person says foreign language. Now, I've also seen employers come in excited to talk about the work they're doing, or things like their bottom line and competitive disadvantage. And the community-based organization comes back at them with historical grievances that actually predate the employer's very existence. I want to applaud the DOE for their comprehensive approach to trying to bridge these gaps. And my hope is to demystify some of the language around a community benefits plan. But first, let me tell you what a union is. A union is an organization formed by workers who are employed by the same employer for the purposes of securing better wages, benefits, and working conditions. And let me tell you what a union is not. A union is not a third party who takes over management of your employees or sets company policies. You still get to do that if your workers form a union. The union simply advocates for workers when they feel like management is being unfair. And a good union is a partner because a good union recognizes that if an employer isn't making money, then there's nothing to share with the workers. Now, I'm a storyteller, so let me tell you a story that resulted in one of the most robust community benefits agreements I've seen. There were 4 parties involved: a government agency, a team of developers, labor unions, and community-based organizations. The government agency had land they wanted to lease for development. It was prime real estate next to a port, so they wanted to develop it for trade and logistics to keep the port competitive. They also wanted the guaranteed revenue of a long-term lease and good jobs for the local community. Second was a group of developers that wanted to lease that land, build some warehouses on it, sublease them out, and do some other port-related development. Third were the labor unions who wanted good jobs for workers. They not only wanted their members to build everything, they wanted to represent the workers in the permanent operations jobs after things were built. And fourth were the groups in the adjacent community who carried a serious grudge against the port. This was primarily a community of color who saw very little of the port's economic benefits and got all of its problems. They suffered much higher asthma rates than the rest of the area due to port-related pollution. And this community opposition was politically potent. All this developer had was an exclusive negotiating agreement with the agency. They still had to finalize the deal, and the agency told them they needed to include a community benefits agreement to do that. Does that sound familiar to the applicants? So negotiations begin, and agency officials set the broad terms of the agreement. They use their power to convene the different parties and assign staff to help where possible. The unions and the developers started meeting and very early on came to a project labor agreement or community workforce agreement, which established the terms and conditions for all the construction work on the project. This was good for the unions because it mandated that all contractors and subcontractors on the project hire workers through the various union hiring halls and pay them union wages and benefits. It was good for the developers because not only were they guaranteed a supply of skilled and trained labor, they also got labor peace, meaning the unions agreed to no strikes or labor disputes during the project. And finally, the unions agreed to publicly support the project. And I cannot stress the importance of that enough because the elected officials valued labor's views on the project. Still, with such intense community opposition, that support was not enough. The community groups were very focused on equity issues, making sure that workers from the local community and those with disadvantaged backgrounds could get equal access to the jobs. They also wanted assurances that the project would not increase the environmental impact of the port on the nearby community. And again, this is where the community workforce agreement came into play, because it provided a legal framework to incorporate the community's equity goals into the project. But before we could do that, we needed to get people talking. The labor, unions, and community groups had some historical issues, but through a lot of hard work, they eventually joined forces and negotiated jointly with the developers and the agency. It was not always pretty in the process, but in the end, the project won unanimous approval, and we all got to stand at a press conference where we shared the terms of a groundbreaking community benefits agreement. Half of the construction jobs would be for local residents. All new of the jobs had to be for newly hired people. Every worker on the project was guaranteed the local living wage. And seeing as we wanted good jobs, we negotiated a first in the nation standard limiting the use of temp agencies in the warehouses. Employers are prohibited from asking about criminal backgrounds when hiring, so that more people from the nearby community could get jobs. On top of that, half of all the permanent jobs on the project had to go to workers from the local community. We set up a one-stop shop with seed funding from the local agency so workers know where to go to get jobs and training, and employers know where to go to find workers. We leveraged that seed funding to get a $500,000 planning grant from the state to establish a training program with the unions and a local community college, and that has since secured even more funding. The developers got approval for a 66-year lease and development agreement, and the local agency gets 66 years of revenue in return. And furthermore, the elected officials got to hang their hat on an agreement that was not only good for the local and national economy, but one that had support from community groups, labor unions, and the business community. That's a win-win-win-win. Now, I won't lie, the negotiations were not easy. Nobody got everything they wanted. But in the end, everyone understood that if they didn't agree to something, then they would get nothing at all. And that understanding, along with an open mind, honest communication, integrity, and the same sort of strong leadership we see from the Biden administration is what got this done. It took a lot of people like me doing shuttle diplomacy who could speak everyone's language. So I encourage you to seek out help. The DOE can offer suggestions and resources to that end. As I said, this community benefits agreement was a win-win, and my hope is that many of you can come back and take my place on a future panel to tell a similar story. Thank you for your time, and I hope this was helpful. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Katrina.
Great, thank you so much, Doug. Now I'm pleased to introduce our second non-DOE speaker, Dr. Ginger Gibson. Dr. Gibson is the Director and Negotiation Lead with the Firelight Group. Dr. Gibson, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Thanks to the DOE for the invitation today. I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit different than community benefit agreements, but has many similarities. In Canada, we call these impact and benefit agreements. Next slide, please. As I noted, I'm with an Indigenous owned company in Canada. We're called the Firelight Group, and we provide research services and support on community benefits agreements and impact benefit agreements across Canada and in the United States on these kinds of issues. We work with communities to provide community-based research to support Indigenous rights, interests, and values. And today, I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory. Next slide, please. In Canada, impact and benefit agreements started in the 1990s. We call them IBAs, impact and benefit agreements. They deal with the impacts, environmental and social and otherwise, and the benefits. It's a contract that is set out between a company and a community that provides Indigenous consent and support for a project. They play an important role in maintaining Indigenous rights and directing specific benefits that communities choose into their communities. They can also mitigate social impacts. So they give project certainty to the proponent, and they're very much a part of the proponent's social license. They're even required in legislation. So in Nunavut, and the Northwest Territories, these agreements are legally required and are being conducted and concluded all across the country. Next slide, please. There's all of these types of provisions. So the previous speaker spoke to some of the employment and training benefits, the procurement benefits, but there's also financial benefits that are required. There's environmental management and environmental controls that communities have over projects. In addition, these kinds of agreements can touch on culture and cultural heritage. All of these things are negotiated. It takes some time, and most of the agreements are confidential. A few agreements in Canada are public, and we use them as the standards out there. Next slide, please. One particular area I'll dig into is employment. Employment benefits can assist industry. There can be many different kinds of benefits that are unlocked. The focus can be across all of the different salary price points, all of the different types of areas so communities in the Northwest Territories, for example, are accessing, as a result of community benefit agreements, all different areas of employment and we have targets in these agreements that set out how many Indigenous employees are going to be brought along and included in the project. This means that employment is local. It also means that there's a strong and secure workforce that's set in place for the proponent. Many of the agreements also touch on the barriers. So they look specifically through research and understanding what those barriers are. They set out a program to address those barriers that deal with recruitment, retention, and advancement. Advancement being a very tricky one in particular because of the kinds of training and education requirements that are often required for Indigenous employees. These are all mitigated through the IBA. Next slide, please. A particular area that was raised to me as of concern for the hydrogen hubs was the question of restorative justice. So today I'm going to focus briefly on 3 different cases where restorative justice, or that question of how do you reach the vulnerable populations and how do you address historic loss. I'm going to touch on 3 cases that address that issue. So the first case is an abandoned uranium mine operating in the 1950s and 60s in northern Canada. Through government to government agreements, so this shows really a clear role for the federal government, there has been a restorative justice addressed. This began in the early 2000s, but now in the last 2 years, agreements have been put in place between the Indigenous government and the federal government to address the historical loss of area, the contaminated site, and the remediation of that site. The proponent themselves also have to pick up many of the obligations that have been set out in the federal government agreement, such as employment requirements. The restorative justice approach in this case focuses on a range of topics. First of all, control over decision-making. So the Indigenous government has the opportunity with the federal government to control contractors that are selected, employment targets, for example. They also have an opportunity to recognize and heal both the land, but also the people who have been excluded from that area. So oftentimes when you have an area that is, as they call it in the United States, a superfund site, we don't use that same language in Canada, but the opportunity to address, recognize, and think about the historic health impacts that were experienced by the Indigenous population. The story is being told, and the federal government and the proponent, along with the Indigenous government, are co-developing that story and telling the story of loss through a co-developed museum exhibit. They're truth-telling about the experience of impacts, and they are engaging in joint monitoring that's going to be led by the Indigenous government. This is accompanied by funds for monitoring to ensure that there's an ability of the Indigenous group to resume their cultural activities on the land. So that's one example of restorative justice as practiced in this one case. In the next slide, I'll talk about another case. That last case looked at a case of uranium mining back in the 1950s. This case now looks at impacts that will be experienced. So when an extractive project in northern Alberta was considered, what the parties realized was that there would be 40 years of loss of use for an Indigenous group of peoples. That loss of use was recognized. And while the proponent had a community benefits agreement that they held with the community, the federal government also set out an agreement to address the cumulative impacts outside of the project site. So when the project area was discussed, it was recognized that the proponent and the community could control impacts in the smaller area where the project was going to be, whereas the federal government and the community could address project effects that were more extensive, that went outside of the project area. So in this case, restorative justice was prospective. What I mean by that is it was looking at a restorative justice for potential loss of cultural use and rights, practice of rights, in an area that was very broad outside of the project area, and that would be experienced if the project proceeded for 40 years. So the program of work focused on a forward-looking redress of loss of practice of culture due to those industrial impacts. And a fund was set aside for the Indigenous government, the Indigenous community, to continue to practice their rights for a 40-year period. So this gives you an example of looking forward, understanding that there will be impacts, and setting out a program of work that will allow the Indigenous government and the parties to address that loss of use. In the final case, it's a very similar issue in the next slide, which looks at marine shipping. In this case, where there was major marine shipping infrastructure in a First Nations territory, the lands are going to be completely and irreversibly transformed. The nation's kitchen sink, their entire area will be transformed in a way that they cannot access their lands or their waters. In this case, the recognition was made that the impacts would be so severe that the project proponent cannot address them in the foreshore of the marine shipping area. Again, restorative justice is being addressed through long-term investments in infrastructure, so the nation has the capacity to move into different areas and has the capacity to practice their rights. The long-term impacts were also documented, recognized by the parties, and addressed through a long-term fund. Again, a prospective long-term fund as a part of the restorative justice approach. In my last slide, I'll reflect on some of these issues and what they mean for community benefit agreements, and explicitly what they might mean for the DOE hydrogen hubs approach. So community impact agreements, in Canada, as I said, we call them IBAs, and we explicitly consider environment and culture. And in this case, most of the IBAs are actually transacted with Indigenous people, as you call them, tribal peoples in the United States. There's an explicitly different focus for Indigenous people, where the focus is on environment and on culture, as well as the other benefits. I suggest that you may want to expect that these kind of issues will emerge in CBAs with Indigenous peoples. In Canada, restorative justice has reviewed past harms and addressed losses, restoring those losses, and we've been attempting to monitor and remediate against past losses. I'll note a few patterns. First of all, where there has been tremendous loss and people have been not able to access their lands, there often is a period of truth-telling and acknowledgement that is required. This requires an open heart and an open mind, and often requires that hard truths are discussed and described. I encourage people not to shy away from these hard truths, but to acknowledge them. I've also told you about 2 cases where we've talked about addressing future losses. It's absolutely fundamental to understand what the nature of impacts will be, and then to consider ways to address those impacts. That means they need to be clearly described and clearly understood. And as I noted for you, there's a role for federal governments to address those historical harms and to address future losses through government-to-government agreements. In Canada, the practice now is to have government-to-community agreements that address harms that cannot be addressed by a proponent. This often requires joint decision-making, as well as monitoring and remediation. That monitoring and remediation can be years and years of work that is jointly developed by the community and by the proponent, requires oversight and community employment, and allows a community to connect to their lands, provides meaningful long-term employment, as well as the ability for people to gain trust and regain a connection and relationship to the land that they hold their rights to. With that, I'll thank everybody for their time and turn it back to you, Katrina.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Gibson. So next, we'll move into our U.S. National Hydrogen Strategy discussion. We will hear from Dr. Sunita Sachapal, Director of the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies Office and the DOE Hydrogen Program Coordinator. Sunita will cover the National Hydrogen Strategy and opportunities. Sunita, over to you.
Great, thank you, Katrina. And if we go to the next slide, I would just like to emphasize this is such a critical time for hydrogen and for the nation. And a big thank you to all the stakeholders who've been interested in hydrogen over the decades. We have an all hands on deck approach, and the hydrogen program, as a reminder, is coordinated across all DOE offices, covering basic science to applied research, developments, demonstration, and deployments. And it includes the entire value chain from hydrogen production through end use, as shown in the H2 at scale graphic, which includes hydrogen production from all of our domestic resources, renewables, nuclear, fossil with CCS for clean hydrogen. And then we can use that hydrogen across sectors. It provides us with that versatility, again, especially in those hard to decarbonize sectors. The Hydrogen Energy Earth Shot is also a critical piece of the program. It's launched by the Secretary of Energy last year. It includes a bold, ambitious goal of $1 for 1 kilogram of clean hydrogen in 1 decade, and that includes research all the way through deployment. So getting to scale, such as through the hydrogen hubs, is a critical piece of that activity. So we have a number of resources, such as the DOE-wide program plan and the draft National Clean Hydrogen Strategy and Roadmap, which I summarized on the next slide. And as a reminder, we released the draft for public comment in September. Now, the comment period closed in December, so we're reviewing all of the stakeholder feedback and plan to publish the final later this year. But it really had 3 critical components. First is target strategic high impact end uses for hydrogen, so especially those hard to decarbonize sectors, and sees the potential for 10 million metric tons of clean hydrogen by 2030, and as much as 50 million metric tons for the United States by 2050, which is aligned with our long-term climate strategy as released by the White House. Second is reduce the cost of clean hydrogen. So there, of course, the hydrogen shot, the hubs are extremely critical because, again, we have to get to scale to drive the cost down and enable commercial viability. And then 3, another critical component of the strategy is focus on regional networks, which includes the bipartisan infrastructure law provision on deploying at least 4 regional clean hydrogen hubs and ramping up scale. Now, of course, we have a number of enabling activities as shown in the bottom. Workforce development is critical, safety codes and standards. We have new policies, incentives such as the tax credits, stimulating private sector investments, such as through our loan program office. And then, of course, in everything we do, we want to emphasize the importance of energy and environmental justice. So if we go to the next slide, I would like to end with just highlighting a few additional opportunities that some of the stakeholders out there may be interested in if you missed the announcements. So as we all know, there's $8 billion for the hydrogen hubs, but in the bipartisan infrastructure law, there are 2 additional provisions. $1 billion for electrolysis research, development, and demonstration that some of you may be interested in, and then $500 million for manufacturing and recycling activities related to hydrogen and through end use. And there are additional opportunities as well. So across offices, again, as a reminder, this is an all hands on deck approach across DOE. And our Office of Technology Transitions, which collaborates across offices, includes the Technology Commercialization Fund, or TCF. There's an open funding opportunity announcement now on the street, and that includes collaborations with national laboratories. So facilitating the technology transfer, for example, from our national labs to the private sector. And then there are additional opportunities, again, across multiple offices, including energy efficiency and renewable energy, fossil energy and carbon management, nuclear energy, the Office of Science, ARPA-E, the Loan Program Office. And so stay tuned. And then very exciting, if you missed the announcement just a few weeks ago, the notice of intent that we issued, one is $750 million a planned FOA or funding opportunity announcement, which will include clean hydrogen electrolysis, manufacturing, and recycling. And then the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies Office FOA, support of hydrogen shot, which also includes component development relevant to hydrogen infrastructure and other technologies that stakeholders may be interested in. So if we click once more, I just want to end with there are many, many resources available, such as our H2IQ monthly webinars, where we publicize all of the activities across DOE, hydrogentools.org, the Center for Hydrogen Safety, the newsletters. And then finally, if you'd like to save the date, we have our annual merit review, or AMR, for the first time in person since COVID. So the week of June 5th to 8th, again, we showcase across DOE all of the hydrogen related activities. So we hope to see you there in person. And again, the hydrogen.energy.gov is the main portal website where you can stay tuned to all the various hydrogen activities. So again, this is a very exciting and unprecedented time in history for hydrogen, for the nation, and even globally. And I want to again emphasize and thank all of you involved as we work together to address our climate crisis. So with that, thank you, Katrina. I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sunita. And finally, we'll hear from Todd Schrader, who is the Director of the Project Management Division at OSED, who will reiterate key themes and closing thoughts. Todd, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katrina. I think you have seen today among all our speakers a tremendous excitement for this program. As David mentioned at the beginning, this is a pivot point potentially in this country for energy production and how we do work moving forward. This program has support throughout the Department of Energy and even throughout the government. I think you also realize, based on what Sunita said and others, this is a all of DOE and all of government and frankly, all of society effort we are on. We realize with cooperative agreements, it's very important that the government has their role, but industry also has a role. And we look forward to working with industry on these partnerships. Again, we understand the excellent hard work that's going into this. These are lots of effort, lots of resources we put in. As Eric said, the concept papers were provided lots of information, and we again thank you for all the hard work. And we realize there's more to come. I will emphasize again the April deadline for the submittal of the application. This webinar, we hope, has been helpful, giving you more information. Again, there's a Q&A website. Any questions you have, please submit it. We endeavor to answer those as quickly as possible going forward. Also, as Katrina said, there are lots of opportunities here. Even if in the end a hydrogen hub doesn't work out for a certain industry, certain community, certain area, there are other opportunities, both with funding opportunity announcements within OSED and with hydrogen-specific activities throughout the Department of Energy. And so I encourage you to look at both the OSED website and DOE's websites in general for other opportunities that might be there. Again, thank you for everyone. I think this is an exciting time. There's lots of opportunities going forward. And I look forward to a few years down the line seeing projects being built, projects coming online and addressing the pressing needs of this country. So with that, Katrina, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Todd. And thank you again to all of our presenters. On behalf of the entire Department of Energy Hydrogen Hubs team, we thank all of the attendees for listening to this Hydrogen Hubs application discussion. We sincerely hope this webinar format helps illuminate some of the content and our thinking in the FOA. And a final reminder, the FOA does remain the controlling document. If information was presented differently in today's webinar from the FOA, The FOA is the guiding document and applicants should refer to the FOA. The recording of this webinar will be posted to the OSED website shortly. And finally, as Todd mentioned, our team continues to welcome questions and comments at the email you see on this slide, which is the formal FOA question and answer email. So thank you again for attending. We wish you a great rest of your day. Take care.